Welcome to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ferenc. If you want to reach me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. It's yourpersonalbank.com. Well, we had a very interesting show last week. I got more feedback or response, I should say, than I've had in a very long time. I do really appreciate listeners reaching out to me. It's really awesome. That way I know that what I'm saying is making an impact. It's making a difference in people's lives. They're wanting more information. And the reason a lot of people reached out to me last week in particular was I was discussing the big, beautiful bill that just passed. We stripped away the noise, the politics. We hear we've heard a lot of different things. And what I just said is, hey, forget the noise. What's actually in the law? It's a law now. And how does it affect us? And there's a lot of things that are going to benefit people in terms of tax planning. The Social Security Administration recently stated that they estimate about 88% of all Social Security recipients will pay no taxes on their Social Security income. Well, that's just an awesome thing for a lot of people. Obviously, they get to keep more of their money. This was a misunderstanding. For example, I spoke to a listener just this week, where he's 62, just started turning on his Social Security income, and he mistakenly thought that it would only affect him if he was 65. No, it's for Social Security recipients. So it's for any age, anyone who's receiving Social Security income. It could, obviously, if you're receiving disability Social Security income, that's tax-free anyway, so that's not a non-issue. But that was one thing that I clarified. And I want to touch on a few more things because it is such a new bill, and there's some opportunities, again, that you may not be aware of. One of those happens to be the additional tax deduction on $6,000 of income on Social Security income, in addition to that is in addition to your standard deduction, which for 2025 happens to be $15,000 for an individual or $30,000 for a couple. I was speaking to another listener and a client of mine where they determined that because the additional deductions that they're getting, they will get to pay less taxes, obviously. They would actually be able to take some of their money from their traditional IRAs, convert them to a Roth without having to pay any taxes or very little tax. We'll put it that way. Obviously, if you put your money into a Roth type of account, it's going to grow tax-free for the rest of your life. So if you have a situation where based on your income, because of the new tax deductions that are in place, by the way, for the next 4 years, this is another misconception or something that people don't realize oftentimes. Yes, the tax bracket changes that were going to expire have been made permanent. So in other words, the tax brackets in 2016 with the original tax plan dropped the brackets or the amount of income tax just about every American paid lower than it was previously. And it was, if they had not passed this bill, then those tax brackets would have reverted back to 2016 levels, which would have been this would have meant a tax increase on nearly everybody who pays taxes. That has now been made permanent. So that again is good news. Our taxes are not going up, or at least the brackets are. That's the point there. The new deduction on Social Security income of $6,000 is in place for 4 years. So is the no tax on tips and no tax on overtime. The no tax on tip provision, by the way, is up to $25,000 income received from tips. The $6,000 deduction on Social Security income for Social Security recipients, again, any age, that will be on top of your standard deduction. So previously, again, a couple had $30,000 standard deduction on income. Well, that'll go up to $36,000 if one's receiving Social Security. It could be $42,000 if both are receiving Social Security, which again might allow you to withdraw some of the money from your IRA, your traditional IRA that is, at little or no tax implication, put it into a Roth type of account, and then let that money grow tax-free. If you want more information on this, want to look into this further, contact me at yourpersonalbank.com. Be happy to look at your situation to determine what makes sense for you. But here's an opportunity that does exist for at least the next 4 years. That's the law in the books now. No guarantee it'll be law 5 years from now. So take advantage of it while it exists. Citizenship requirements for Medicaid, work requirements for Medicaid. These are all good things. This is going to help ensure that Medicaid is there for those that need it. Well, the Social Security trustees and Medicare trustees were talking about and putting out reports stating that these programs are going to be running out of money in the next decade or so, or even less. Well, it turns out a lot of the reason why is there's a lot of people on Medicaid, Medicare, who frankly are not eligible, should not have been on it at all. Again, if you're an able bodied adult and you can't work 80 hours a month or go to school or work with charities or whatever, I don't know that us taxpayers should be supporting your lifestyle. If somebody's disabled, they have a genuine need, that's one thing. But if you're able bodied and you're unwilling to work, I don't think we should support that, obviously. A couple other things that are in the big, beautiful bill that have not gotten as much attention, and I just ran out of time last week. The child tax credit has increased from $2,000 to $2,500. So those of you with dependents, you're going to get a bigger tax deduction for that. I was talking to someone. Here's something I want to share. Thing I'm concerned about, and I'm seeing a little bit of this starting to bubble up. And my hope is this is something that doesn't become more common. Some people are starting to see where, people who are here illegally, of course, but have not committed any additional crimes. They've been working hard. They've kept their nose clean. They've stayed out of trouble, all that. They're still not participating in the economic system of the United States for the most part. Most of them are working for below minimum wage in many cases. So they're getting taken advantage of, but they haven't caused any problem. Maybe they've, started families here. They got relationships. I heard one person say, yeah, if I knew somebody and I was friends with them or whatever, and then I found out they're going to be deported, that would be tough. And I understand where that sentiment is coming from. Also, we have a Republican congressperson I believe from Miami. Her name's Representative Salazar, who's put out this proposal for amnesty. I mean, she doesn't call it amnesty. She's saying, they're not, if people who've been here for 5 years or longer will, and they haven't committed any additional crimes other than crossing the border illegally, allow them a way to pay $1,000 a year, start paying their taxes, and give them, in essence, a way to, it's not really a green card, but basically a legal way of staying here. Here's the problem that I have with that. First of all, these are illegal aliens, or as the legacy media or the leftists like to say, undocumented. Well, in some respects, that's true. They are undocumented. We have no documentation of when they came into this country, many of them. So how is when ICE say has a deportation order from a judge and they knock on the door and they want to take them back, and again, they have a legal order to do so, and they say, no, I've been here over 5 years. Well, who's to prove how long they've been here? There's no documentation to prove one way or the other. Would there be incentive for somebody who's been here 2 or 3 years to lie? Remember, they broke the law and lied to get here in the first place. So I'd say the odds are very high. And one of the things you're going to find is that would completely decimate the ability for ICE to proceed with the legal deportation orders that they're enforcing. These are the laws that are on the books in our country, have been for decades, many of them. These are laws that Congress passed. They're, in most cases, they have a deportation order, and they chose not to leave. By the way, there's another little known federal law for illegals that states that if you move, you have to notify the government within 30 days of your new address. Well, again, most illegals aren't doing that either. So they're not only they break the law to cross the border, now they're breaking further laws. But the biggest issue is it would stop the deportation in its tracks. And then they would have to go to court again, determine how long have they been here. They may or may not be able to prove that. That would be a mess, and it would completely just put a whole monkey wrench in this whole system. That's the kind of stuff I think a lot of people are not thinking about. And again, it's an effort by those who want the illegals here for various reasons, big business, for cheap labor, certainly. And there are liberals or leftists, I would like to say, who want them here so they can count them in the census and have more representation in Congress and the Electoral College, for example. But my last reason I'm against it is this, and I've posed this question, I've heard others say the same thing. Let's say somebody robbed a bank 20 years ago, and then after that point, they, lived a good, clean life. They didn't break the law, started a family. They did all the right things. And then 20 years, and then now suddenly it was determined, it was proven, they were caught that they robbed the bank 20 years ago. My question is this: should we just forget that they robbed the bank, or would they still be prosecuted and have to pay the consequences of doing that? You broke a federal law when you crossed the border. Should that be rewarded? And my answer is no. And again, it sets a bad precedent. Many of those people will be less likely to follow laws in the future. That's why part of the reason why so many illegals, don't buy insurance, car insurance, for example. And all our car insurance rates have gone up. See, who's been harmed by all these illegals coming through? Well, all of us buy car insurance. We've had to pay way more for it. Housing has gone up. When you bring in millions of people, they got to live somewhere. Housing, it's no secret. You have a housing shortage and you add 10, 20 million more people or so, housing prices are going to go up. Inflation has been exacerbated by having so many people here because they got to eat, right? But to make matters worse, many of these illegals have gotten benefits like Medicare, food assistance, housing assistance, loans for businesses, all types of things that are all funded by taxpayers. Stay tuned in the next segment. I'm going to share some more things about this, and I'll make some recommendations along the way of what you can do to thrive in this economy as we go through the transition. There's a lot of exciting things coming, but there's certainly a lot of transitions, so stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ferenc. For more information, contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422.
Welcome to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ferenc. If you want to reach me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. It's yourpersonalbank.com. So there's some other provisions in the big, beautiful bill that's now passed as law. As I stated in the first segment of last week, I got a lot of response on this because I'm cutting to the chase, cutting out the noise, forgetting the politics about it. What's in the bill, or now law, and how does it affect us? How can we plan forward? And one of the things I shared is those that are early in the first segment, if you missed it, by the way, you can go to the Your Personal Bank app and listen to this or any of the previously recorded shows anytime you want. Each has its own title, so you can listen to anything that might interest you. But one of the provisions is Social Security recipients receiving a $6,000 additional tax credit on top of the standard deduction, on top of the $2,000 deduction for seniors, that is anyone 65 or older, which means there are opportunities now for some people, I've already met several, where they likely can take money from traditional IRAs, pay little or no tax on it, put it into Roth type of accounts, and let it grow tax-free for the rest of their lives. That's a tremendous opportunity, and you can do it through a number of accounts. And annuities is also one of the options you can use, certainly to grow the money safely. Insured, guaranteed, got the best rates we've seen in 40 plus years. I've got companies that are paying 8% guaranteed up front. I've got other companies that are paying up to 17% bonus if you have to offset, say, a penalty on an existing annuity. Let's say you have one. I've run into this several times already. Traditional IRA annuity, for example, and you got a penalty, you can't get out of it. Well, I had somebody with a 11.5% bonus last week. We transferred, and he got a 17.5% bonus, which means he was up about 6% out the gate. And the minimum guarantees on the new annuity were more than he was earning on the old. So it was a total no-brainer. Plus, he can move a portion of that money into a Roth IRA annuity and now grow the money tax-free for life. There's some tremendous opportunities out there, partly because of the higher interest rate environment. It's the golden age of fixed assets. We're seeing the best dividend rates, interest rates on annuities, things like that we've seen in 40 plus years, literally. I'm not kidding. I'm not blowing smoke. I'm not even exaggerating. If anything, I'm kind of underplaying it a little bit, because when I share the numbers, not only, again, in that gentleman's example, he was up 6% day one with an 11.5% surrender fee with one of the better companies from an annuity that was only 2 or 3 years old. But the new one, the guaranteed minimums were higher than what he was earning previously. So again, it was a total no-brainer. If you have an annuity that's 2 or 3 years old or older, I strongly encourage you to take a look. Or if you ever consider an annuity, grow your money safely, insured without downside, with tremendous upside potential, no downside risk, and the best numbers we've seen in decades, contact me at yourpersonalbank.com. I'm an independent. I'm accessed to over 50 companies. I'll show you the best ones, plain and simple. It doesn't matter. I don't care who we work with. who's going to offer you the best deal. That's what it boils down to. So again, yourpersonalbank.com if that interests you. But a few other things that are that were in the big beautiful bill that's now law that could make a difference for people is I mentioned the child tax credit increasing from $2,000 to $2,500. Another one is loan interest deduction on new vehicles that are purchased that are built in the United States. That is a really interesting thing, and I like this this idea. This is something unique we've never seen. So I think this really actually came from Trump himself. A lot of people take loans to buy cars. And today, especially, interest rates are pretty high for new car purchases. I know I was looking at purchasing a new truck about a year and a half ago, and I've got good credit, and they wanted like 9%. I was like, holy cow. But at least if you maybe were doing it for business, you needed some tax deductions, now you get a tax deductible expense, it could make sense. Or maybe it didn't before. And these are things that'll, of course, boost the economy and help, real everyday average Americans, the type of people that, probably don't have the ability to pay cash for vehicles, or they don't want to tie up that much money on a vehicle. Vehicle prices too have just, gone through the roof. I know I bought a 2003 Ford F-150, a nice one. And, I think I paid $16,000 or $17,000 for that truck, brand new, 2003, I believe. I bought a same model truck, similar package, and it was close to $50,000 a couple of years ago. I mean, so the amount of money to buy something just like a vehicle, more than double in 20 years. I mean, the prices of things with historical long-term inflation. This is something I share all the time. If you go back 100 years, the inflation's averaged about 2.5%. Certainly, the last 4 or 5 years, we've had higher than average inflation. A lot because of excess government spending. We've discussed that many times. But the reality is, things like vehicles, now they're nicer, don't get me wrong. There's more, I will say this, the newer truck has more amenities, if you will. It has more things. It's a nicer truck. It does ride smoother. I'm not arguing that point. It's a nice vehicle, but it's, costs not triple, but gosh, 2.5 times more in 20 years. I mean, that's a pretty steep increase. So given the fact that this big, beautiful bill will now give a tax deduction on the loan interest for these types of purchases, that's going to be huge. Now, I don't know all the details behind it yet, but I think it's a great idea. That will help a lot of people. The charitable contribution deduction is another interesting one. You can take the standard deduction or you can itemize your deductions. First Trump term, when the previous tax law changed, he actually doubled the standard deduction. You can take the standard deduction or you itemize. The only reason to itemize is because you have more deductions than the standard deduction would give you. And don't quote me on this, but if I remember right, the standard deduction before Trump was around $6,000 a person. He doubled it to like 12. It's now $15,000 per person, $30,000 for a couple. So the bottom line is this: unless you have more than, as a couple, $30,000 in deductible expenses, there's no reason to itemize your taxes. It just makes things difficult. You have to fill out the long form. You have to pay an accountant probably more to do all that stuff. What you can do is, if you have less than $30,000 as a couple or $15,000 in deductions as a single, you can just fill out the short form. I know it's a page or two. I mean, you can pay somebody to do that for you if you want. You can do it yourself, frankly. A lot of people do. And you just take the standard deduction and move on. The problem with that, and here's the thing most people didn't realize, it's been ingrained into us that, like purchasing a home, the mortgage interest deduction, typically for the average person that did not own a business, that was typically their largest deduction they could receive. Well, when that standard deduction was doubled in 2017, roughly 95% of Americans no longer filed the long form. They only took the standard deduction. So a lot of people thought incorrectly that they were still benefiting from mortgage interest deduction on their mortgage, when in reality, over 90% of Americans were not anymore. Now, frankly, that's not necessarily a bad thing because their standard deduction was actually higher. It was actually bigger. That's a good thing, but that was a common misconception. You also lost like charitable deductions, things like that. You couldn't write that off anymore because, again, you took the standard deduction. The new tax law has changed that, and it brings the charitable tax deduction back for those who take the standard deduction starting in 2026. That one actually starts next year. And you can take up to $1,000 per person or $2,000 per couple in what's called an above-the-line charitable contribution deduction. An above-the-line deduction is one where you take the standard deduction, but before that, you can actually write off some additional, again, $1,000 a person or $2,000 a couple for charity and take the standard deduction. Well, if you take a couple, for example, with a $30,000 standard deduction, you could give away another $2,000 and get to deduct that. So $32,000 of your first $32,000 of your income essentially is tax-free. If you're a senior, you also get another $2,000 deduction. And if you receive Social Security, you get another $6,000 above the line standard deduction. So, you're getting up to $36,000, $38,000. Say one party of a couple is a senior receiving Social Security. It could be, 42 or something. You could potentially have something around $44,000 of income completely tax-free. Again, because of the new tax law, the big, beautiful bill that passed. So these are things that most people are just not aware of yet. There's a number of tax deductions, increases in brackets, all kinds of different things that have been passed. This was a big bill. There was a lot of changes. And for the most part, a lot of these are there's income phase outs and all that. I don't have, there's not enough time in a show like this to share all the different things. But there's going to be a lot of people that are going to do a lot of changes in tax planning. You're going to want to start early on this one, because if you work with a tax person, they're going to be really busy this fall and in next spring, because, well, a lot of these things you'll have to do before the end of the year so you can take advantage of it before you file next April. There's going to be a lot of change, a lot of questions, and you will probably want to get on it this time because they're going to be really, really busy. Okay. Oh, a couple other quick things. The Golden Dome, there's funding for that. I've always thought, and I agree with Trump on this when he states that Israel has a dome. I have a missile defense system basically created and, from us. Why shouldn't we have something like that? There's a lot of things that have to do with taxes, tax deductions, in general, allowing you to keep more of your money. A lot of things to like about this bill. It did cut overall spending about 2%, by the way, federal spending, a step in the right direction. The sad part is it was the largest tax cut in the history of the United States, about a 2% cut overall. Frankly, in my opinion, that's pathetic. I would have liked to seen a whole lot less cut, because I've shared many times on the show, prior to COVID, the federal government has increased spending by over 50%, while we have 2% more people in this country. So our population has increased about 2% since pre-COVID, and we're spending over 50% more money. That just doesn't add up. That doesn't work. That's not sustainable long-term. Anyone who's fiscally responsible should want our federal government to spend a lot less than it spends. There's no reason whatsoever, no logical reason you can give me for the government to spend 50% more money than it spent 4 or 5 years ago, and we only have 2% more people. The reality is we could have realistically increased spending about 2%. That would be justified. The government was spending too much money pre-COVID. It was wasting money then. Not as bad as it is now, but certainly there was waste and fraud pre-COVID, yet we still had roads and schools and the military and everything else that's necessary for a society. We could certainly do that again. Now, do I realistically believe that we'll get back to pre-COVID spending levels? No. Would I love to see it? Absolutely. Is it logical? Is it fiscally responsible? Absolutely. But do I expect it to happen? No. But the more we push, gosh, could we at least get halfway there? I mean, again, a 2% step is a small step in the right direction, but understand it's a very, very small step. We should at least cut half the difference, right? And maybe we still will in the future. There's rescission packages coming. There's been some cuts to NPR and things like that have come down recently. I like those things. Again, the government needs to spend a lot less money to alleviate inflation, both now and in the future, and bring back the cost, interest rates, the cost of everything. Because if they don't, it's just going to keep going up. I'm going to encourage you to stay tuned in the next segment, because I'm going to share how you can benefit from the government's lack of financial responsibility. So again, wherever there's a problem, there is also an opportunity. So I'm going to share that with you in the next segment. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ferenc. For more information, contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ferenc Toth. Want more information? Contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ferenc Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ferenc. If you want to reach me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. It's yourpersonalbank.com. So there's an article in Business Insider from veteran investor Bill Smead. Now, you may or may not know who that is, but he's run a Smead value fund that has actually beaten 96% of his peers over the last 15 years. Now, this is according to Morningstar. So this is somebody who's been around a while, has a proven track record in investing, and, somebody you might want to pay attention to. And the point of his article that he discussed, I think, is very interesting, is he stated stocks just hit a line of death, last reach of the peak of the dot-com bubble, according to Bill Smead. And what he's referring to is there's a chart that's an inflation-adjusted S&P 500, and if you look at it from 1966 to now, there's 3 points in time. This is radio, or, if you're listening on podcast or Spotify or whatever, any other medium out there. But let me describe it. It's really not that complicated. All of you have seen a stock market chart, I'm sure, and you can see it has peaks and valleys, right? Well, there's 3 peaks that the S&P 500 has hit, inflation adjusted, since 1966. The first time was in 1966. They called it the Nifty 50, which was a bubble burst that occurred back then. This was before my time, but it did occur. And there was, from that point, there was a 65% decline over the next roughly decade, actually. The 70s were tough with inflation, oil embargoes, all kinds of things that went on during that time frame. And so from the peak to the trough was a 65% drop. And then from that point on, it went, goes to actually about 1980. So at that point going forward, the market for the next 27 years overall kept going up. In fact, by the way, it took 27 years from the 1966 peak to get back to even. It actually occurred about in the 1990s. Again, this is all inflation adjusted, and that's really important to understand because, that's the true value of a dollar, or true value of your buying power, isn't it? So it took 27 years for it to recover back to where it was in 1966. That occurred in the early 90s. It hit, of course, a peak in 2020, the dot-com bust, the dot-com bubble. I was around for that one. That was for my first couple of years in the financial business, my 25th year, actually. And I came into it about the last year of the bubble and then watched it burst. And the top to bottom, it turns out, interestingly, from the dot-com bubble to the bust was 65% also, inflation adjusted. Now that occurred, of course, about 2010. So we had the dot-com bubble, it dropped, it came back up some, and then dropped again, of course, with the Great Recession. From that point, it was 17 years. So it was 2017 before you got back to where you were in 2020, inflation adjusted, 17 years to break even. The third time, of course, now is we've just hit that line again here in 2025. His point is, it's a foreboding reminder of how frothy the current environment is. This is the third time we're in this type of scenario since 1966. But one of the other things I like to point out on this is the drop from 1966 to get back even, inflation adjusted, took 27 years to get back to even. The dot-com bubble bust and inflation adjusted back to even was 17 years. This is why when you hear people talk about when you invest in the stock market, think about the long term, hang in there, it'll come back, but it might take a while, all right? That's fine when you're younger and you have time. The problem that you see, what happens is when somebody's, getting older, they have less time to work with. This is, common knowledge out there is, look, if you're going to invest in the market and it has a correction, do you have 5 or 10 years to wait for it to come back to even? Because it easily could do that. It could even be longer, but that's a reasonable expectation, certainly. If you don't have the 5 to 10 years to wait for a correction to get back to where you were, because let's say you're nearing retirement, you're at or in retirement, and going to need that money for income, that's where you get creamed. The timing in terms of when you retire is critical, because if, for example, there's many studies to show this, many charts, you can look at it pretty much anywhere. But if you retire into, let's say, a downturn in the market, let's say it drops 20% or whatever, and now you start taking, let's say you take the 4% rule. Let's use that as an example. So you retire. Market takes a 20% correction. That's not a massive one, by the way. That's kind of considered normal, all right? And you take your 4% out that first year you retire for income, well, you're now down 24%, aren't you? So to recover from that, it gets a lot harder. And again, what a lot of people don't realize is, let's say you had $100,000 in an account. Let's use a simple example. It loses 10%. So you had $100,000, it loses 10%, now it's worth 90. Well, if it goes up 10% this following year, you're not back up to 100 because you only got 90,000. So you'd be at 99, wouldn't you? So again, think about this. You got 100,000 in a portfolio, in an account, drops 10%. That's not a large drop. You have 90,000 left. That second year, you get a 10% return, positive return on 90,000. You now have 99, don't you? So you lost 10% the first year, you gained 10% the second year. Most people think they're back to even. You're not. You're actually behind a little bit. And that's on a relatively mild correction. The more severe the correction, the more severe the downturn, the greater the upside return has to be to recover to get back to even. And then to add insult to injury, this is why it's so critical when you start taking money out of a portfolio. If you take 4% out or 5% out or whatever it is you take for supplement income, you're down even farther on that down year. Well, how do you avoid that? How do you protect yourself from that type of scenario? Again, we're at all-time highs, adjusted for inflation, the third time we've hit this point since 1966. So it's a pretty big deal. Well, what is advised and recommended is you need to have some money set aside that's not subject to market risk so that you can survive on those funds while this correction plays itself out. Ideally, you probably have a couple years worth or more money to weather the storm, weather the correction, if you will, so that you're not pulling money from a portfolio at a down point or on a downward trajectory point, which means you would actually accelerate that downward trajectory, right, if you're taking withdrawals. So that's where the diversification is so important, is so valuable. Now, a lot of people have used the stock and bond mix portfolio, the 60-40, what is it? I forget the term it's used, but we all know the 60-40 stock bond portfolio mixed. It's been recommended by modern portfolio theory for decades. That has worked for the most part for much of that time. The problem we've been facing more recently is and you can see this in more recent charts and things like that, where you see downturns. Oftentimes with tough economic times, bonds are negatively affected more so than they used to be. In other words, they correlate more than they used to. That's why, again, many people you're seeing state you really need to look at an uncorrelated asset. And what is that? It just means it's an asset that has nothing to do with, for example, if you're in a portfolio primarily in the stock market, for your diversification strategy, to say set aside 2, 3, 4, 5 years that you could live on if needed to weather a downward turn or a correction or weather the storm, an economic storm that is, it needs to be uncorrelated. It has nothing to do with the market or the economy or risk. In other words, guaranteed is ideal. And that's, again, where your personal bank can come in, be so powerful. Annuities can play that role also because, again, they're guaranteed the downside principle. They're not going to ride the ups and downs of the stock market. They're just not affected. And the principle is guaranteed. So I saw this a ton in 08, 09, for example, where portfolios were down 20, 30, 40%. And yet the annuities were not only the same, many were growing, many of them with guaranteed upside. Again, it's a golden, I keep saying it, but it's so true. It's a golden era of fixed assets. There's never been a better time pretty much in your lifetime, certainly not since the 1970s, to look at fixed assets like annuities, dividend paying insurance policies, your personal bank as a diversification strategy so that you have money there to weather the storm. It's going to occur, folks. That's another thing. This is a human nature thing. I share this all the time. But when things have been good for a while, and certainly the last several years in the stock markets, that's been the case for the most part, particularly if you were in S&P 500 or even more so, some of the tech stocks that were just going crazy for a while. Not so much anymore, of course, but definitely were going crazy. And, you were doing really well. And, human nature, we get comfortable, right? We get into our comfort zones. It's amazing how, in one respect, human beings are so resilient, yet at the same time, how we're so resistant to change at the same time. We resist change. Great example is if you move into a bigger house or a nicer car, it's amazing how you quickly adjust to that nicer or bigger or newer living situation, right? And it's hard. We have a hard time, much harder time of downsizing. Feel restricted. It's just, again, it's a human nature thing. It's amazing how quickly we then adjust, because there are times when people through decisions, life changes, whatever, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes not, where they've had to downsize their home or their living arrangement. And at first it feels very uncomfortable. It feels very difficult because we got used to something else, right? We got used to the bigger house or the nicer apartment or the nicer car or whatever it was we were in. And now we've downsized to something that's smaller, maybe not as nice, maybe not as roomy, maybe not have as many amenities. But then within usually a matter of weeks, months, maybe and even weeks, it's amazing how we get used to the new normal. So we resist change, yet we're very resilient to it. That resistance of change plays into investing thoughts, emotions, actions of how people do that. They get used to a certain norm. And then when the ground shifts underneath them, most people tend to resist that change or ignore it. Sometimes they'll put their head in the sand. We call it the ostrich syndrome. You put your head in the sand, hope it doesn't affect you or hope it gets better. If you have a situation where you've got a couple years or 3 or 4 years, maybe, or more even, depends on your situation, your comfort level, your risk tolerance, all that, where you've got this account over here, it's safe, it's guaranteed, it's growing. Hey, if it's a personal bank, it's tax-free on top of it, highly liquid. You can access it at any point, whenever you want to. And so when something happens, when an economic downturn occurs, when the markets take a hit, when they correct, these things happen, they always do, you're fine. You can let that portfolio, instead of pulling money from it during that downturn and exacerbating the problem, you can pull from this other bucket, this other source that's safe, guaranteed, it's there. You don't have to worry about it, and retain and allow that to breathe, allow it to come back and recover before you start tapping that again. It's just a really, really smart diversification tool. And I'll add one more piece to all this. The one limitation with annuities, to be fair, is the free withdrawals. You're limited on how much you can take out, but there's something called an MVA, or market value adjustment, that when it works in your favor, and we're seeing that happen as we speak, again, that's why I keep saying it's a golden age of fixed assets, even the early surrender schedule can often be eliminated even within 1 year. And I had this happen just this week with a client. I'm going to share this example and why you really want to consider and look into annuities again, or a newer one, because the market value adjustments and the penalty phase of annuities oftentimes getting wiped out, so you can take all your money out of your account and more and then some, even after 1 year in an annuity. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned for more common sense from Ferenc. For more information, contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show with Ferenc Toth. Want more information? Contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. Now back to the show with Ferenc Toth.
Welcome back to the Your Personal Bank Show. This is Ferenc. If you want to reach me, you can do so at yourpersonalbank.com. Yes, you will reach me. It's yourpersonalbank.com. So if you were listening to the last segment, you heard me discuss one of the strengths of annuities. I understand this show is focused on your personal bank, growing your money insured, guaranteed, tax-free, highly liquid, getting positive arbitrage. But I'm having to bring up annuities more because, well, as good as your personal banks are, and they are, the dividends are strong, they're growing. We've seen some of the best numbers we're seeing in decades, literally 40 plus years. But we're also seeing that even in annuities, even more so, even more pronounced because of the higher interest rate environment, which again, I don't have time to discuss at this show, but I have many times before, is not likely to change anytime in the near future. Most projections are for the next 5 to 10 years, folks. Don't expect interest rates to move down much because it has to do with the bond market, bond yields. The bond market's driving the bus, not the Federal Reserve. I know everybody's getting on the Federal Reserve about lowering rates. Let me share a little secret with you. The Federal Reserve dropped interest rates 0.5 point last fall, shortly before the election. What happened to interest rates? Do you remember? They actually went up. Everybody thought, oh, great, we got a 0.5 point cut with the Fed. That was about October of 24. Mortgage rates actually went up. Why? Mortgage rates follow the 10-year Treasury. Sophisticated real estate investors understand this. Most individuals do not. You take the 10-year Treasury yield or interest rate that it's paying plus 2 to 3%, and that gives you the 30-year fixed mortgage, not the Federal Reserve. You had to pay attention to what they were doing most of the past decade because of the historical low interest rate environment that they pushing interest rates so low. We were seeing sub 3% 30-year fixed mortgages, and that was because of the Federal Reserve. They were artificially stimulating the market, the economy, to the downside in terms of borrowing rates, interest rates, easy monetary policy. This is why we saw such an increase in asset values. That and all the government spending, those two things put together cause asset prices to increase and inflation to increase. Well, that's all changed. In fact, the Federal Reserve is selling assets. It's called quantitative tightening. You know, they advertise a quantitative easing a lot because they were printing money. It was easy money, cheap money. You know, people love that. Well, they've been doing the opposite now for the last couple of years, and you're seeing a shortening or limiting of the overall money supply. In other words, the Federal Reserve is sucking money out of the system by selling assets, bringing less currency in the system. There's less money, and that is a long-term downward trend on asset values. If they continue to do this, which they are clearly doing and showing no sign of changing because their balance sheet got way out of proportion. 9 trillion in assets, which was like 3-4 times more than they owned, just a few years prior. I mean, they ballooned their balance sheet like crazy. And the Federal Reserve bought a lot of bonds when their interest rates were really low, really cheap. They're losing a lot of money. So they're selling assets. It's called quantitative tightening. We're seeing a reduction of the money supply. We've seen this before a few times in history. It's rather rare. It happened during the Great Depression, happened a couple other times where money got tight and the money got short. And that's where they're headed towards. It's going that direction. My point is this: Federal Reserve could drop interest rates right now. There's a lot of pressure lately for them to do that. I don't think it's going to make much difference. Again, we saw the same thing happen in October of 2024. They dropped 0.5 point. Mortgage rates went up. And I believe we'll see a similar thing because it has to do with all the government debt and the bond market. Record levels of bonds being sold, record levels of debt being issued because the government's still spending record amount of money, which creates a record amount of supply, which pushes interest rates up. In other words, if you're borrowing money for a mortgage, a car, or anything else, you're competing against the U.S. government for that money. There's a lender on the other side. There's somebody when you borrow money, there's somebody on the other side of that transaction, a lender who's giving you that money, or an investor. Well, they have a choice of where they invest or lend their money. They can lend it to the U.S. government by buying bonds, or they can lend it to you. Who's a better bet? Who's a better credit risk? Well, even with the problems the U.S. government has, they're still considered a far better credit risk. The U.S. government is, well, frankly, than most governments in the world, certainly better than just about any individual. So they're going to lean towards the government first, and they might get a little bit lower interest rate lending to them than you, but it's considered safer. Now you can agree with that or disagree with that, but that's the industry. So again, when the government is borrowing so much money, they're in the market competing for dollars against you and I. What that means, that means interest rates are going to stay higher for longer. That's part of the reason you're hearing even the Federal Reserve say that. And the amount of money, even if, here's the last thing to understand about this, even if the U.S. government balances their budget, in other words, they stop spending more than they receive, reduce the deficit. That's what Doge was discussing. That's what Trump's been discussing. Even if they accomplish that goal, which would be great, that'd be a positive, no question, it still does not solve the problem entirely because there's over 36 trillion of existing debt on the books. Much of that renews or matures. Bonds are much like CDs. They sell for a time frame. The government sells the bond for a certain period of time. When that bond matures, they don't pay it down. They don't pay the debt down. They just resell it to the next buyer at the current interest rate. Well, there's a record amount of debt on the books, and over the next 10 years, most of that is going to renew. In other words, they'll have to resell it, which means there'll be a record amount of debt offered on the bond markets for the next 10 years, and which means that will push interest rates to the high side. Now, why is this so important? Overall, long-term, higher interest rates are bad for real estate. That's no secret. Long-term, higher interest rates are bad for business. Higher cost of doing business. Higher cost to borrow money to grow or expand your business. What does that do to stock prices? It has a detrimental effect. I'm not saying the stock market is going to go down, but it's going to affect earnings. It's going to reduce earnings. Companies will be less profitable. The stocks are not going to go up as much. Some will even go down. Well, some of the weaker companies will not survive. They'll fall off the wagon, go bankrupt. Those kinds of things we will see happen. It'll be kind of like a slow motion crash, if you know what I'm saying. It's not all going to happen at once, but this is going to happen over a period of time. Now, because of all this, the higher interest rate environment and all that type of stuff, the opportunities, it creates an opportunity. A crisis or change creates opportunity. There's I don't know if it's Japanese or Chinese word that I believe it's opportunity or a crisis, I believe also means opportunity. I believe it translates to both. I'm not certain which language it is, but that's something I've heard. And that's so appropriate. There's winners and losers in every economic situation. There's winners and losers in every change that's going to occur. And the winners are the ones that recognize the change and adjust accordingly. And I discussed some of that I believe in the last segment, where again, human nature, we are reluctant or hesitant, we resist change, yet as human beings, we're remarkably adaptable. Once we decide to make the change or forced to make a change, it's remarkable how quickly we adjust to that change. Again, think of a time when you had to downsize a car or house or something like that. And at first it was probably uncomfortable, even if you did it voluntarily. Yet look how quickly you adjusted to that and realized, hey, I can handle that. I can manage this. This isn't so bad. But the idea of it and the process of it was the challenging part. Again, that's basic human nature. And the fact that the Federal Reserve has been driving the bus for so long, well over a decade, again, with the low interest rate environment, easy monetary policy, cheap money, great for business, great for stocks, great for real estate. Okay, that's why we see part of the reason why I saw the asset values increase so dramatically in such a short time. Much of that was because bulk of that was because of the Federal Reserve. It wasn't because these companies were doing so great. It was just, hey, easy money, man. We're going to borrow hand over fist and grow our business, right? And we can, really boost our profits and make the numbers look great and cause our stock price to go up, for example. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Well, we're not in that scenario anymore. The bond market, the debt is driving the bus. It's the bond market that's driving the bus. So I predict if the Federal Reserve drops interest rates, They're not going to go down a whole lot. We're not going to see 3% 30-year fixed mortgages. I'd be willing to bet, certainly in the next 5 to 10 years, what's going to change it? It's really simple. If the federal government starts reducing their debt, actually not only stop spending more money than they receive every year, which they're still doing, they're still spending a roughly $2 trillion a year more than they receive, which is a incredible clip. It's way, way out of line for the next 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it may be. Interest rates, for the most part, are going to be on the high side, and you can take advantage of it. That's the opportunity. Fixed assets are the opportunity. Annuities, your personal bank, dividend-paying policies, those kinds of things are the things that are going to thrive, certainly easily in the next decade or so, where the past decade, stocks, real estate, those kinds of things definitely thrived in the past decade. So adjust accordingly. The winners and the losers, the winners are the ones that recognize when change occurs. Adjust, make the change. Don't be a dinosaur. Don't go extinct. At least give yourself an opportunity to diversify. At least give yourself an opportunity that if indeed the stock market does what it did the last 2 times it hit this point where it pulled back 65%, inflation adjusted peak of the S&P 500 that hit in 1966 and again in 2000, both of those occasions the markets pulled back peak to trough 65%. Can it do it again? The answer is, of course it could. Don't fool yourself. Don't listen to those that say it'll never go down again and we're just going to keep going. They said that last time. Now, will it? Again, no one knows, but prepare yourself so that you can weather a storm. You can let your portfolio ride if we see a correction, see a downturn, particularly if you're needing to pull money from it to live on. And the last thought I'll leave you with is the 4% withdrawal rule is the most common one we hear about. I've got guaranteed income riders. They'll guarantee you 7, 8% withdrawal guaranteed for life. Why would you settle from 4% income when you could get 7 or 8% guaranteed? If you want more information, contact me at yourpersonalbank.com. Stay tuned next week to more great information on the Your Personal Bank Show. And as long as it's on our money, in God we trust.
Listen Tuesdays at noon and Saturdays at 1 to the Your Personal Bank Show for more information. Contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. That's 866-268-4422. This show is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information. The presenter and guests of this program do not engage in legal, accounting, or tax advice. Professional advice regarding your situation should be sought if required. Some products discussed may have limitations and not be available in all states. Excessive unpaid loans may affect performance. Distributions may become taxable if not managed properly. Replacements may not be suitable for everyone. There may be charges when replacing coverage. Dividend rates and bank line of credit rates may change. For current rates, contact Ferenc at 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com. Again, that's 866-268-4422 or yourpersonalbank.com.